The intergalactic command center's main hall stretched across 17 city blocks, its crystalline walls pulsing with emergency red light as thousands of beings from across the known universe huddled in barely controlled panic. Representatives from the Zephyrian Empire clutched their translation devices with trembling tentacles, while the normally stoic Silicon Collective's representatives sparked erratically, their circuits overloading with stress. The air itself seemed to vibrate with fear, as holographic displays showed the same terrifying image on repeat, a massive, obsidian sphere floating in the void of space, its surface crawling with alien symbols that hurt to look at directly. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Commander Vexthara of the Centauri Defense Force stood at the central podium, her forearms gesturing frantically as she addressed the assembly. Her usually pristine blue exoskeleton was dulled with exhaustion, and the bioluminescent patches along her neck flickered irregularly, a sure sign of extreme stress among her species. "Citizens of the galaxy," she began, her voice amplified through the center's quantum sound system, "we face an unprecedented threat. The device you see before you was discovered 3 rotations ago in the Omega Nebula. Our finest scientists, our most advanced artificial intelligences, our greatest military minds, all have failed to understand or neutralize this weapon." A collective shudder ran through the crowd as the hologram zoomed in on the sphere's surface. The alien markings seemed to shift and writhe, forming patterns that defied comprehension. Dr. Keth'mira, the Confederation's leading xenoarchaeologist, had already suffered 2 mental breakdowns attempting to decode the symbols, and the synthetic minds of Epsilon Prime had declared the device logically impossible before shutting themselves down entirely to prevent permanent damage to their processors. In the back corner of the massive hall, almost hidden behind a support pillar designed to look like a fossilized tree from ancient Valdris, sat a lone human figure. Marcus Chen looked remarkably unremarkable. Average height, slightly rumpled khaki pants, a blue polo shirt with a small logo that read TechFlow Solutions, and a badge hanging from a retractable cord that identified him as Level 2 IT Support Specialist. His laptop bag sat at his feet, worn and practical, with several cable management straps and what appeared to be at least 3 different types of adapters hanging from the side. Marcus had been in the middle of replacing a faulty network switch on Sublevel 7 when the emergency lockdown began. He'd tried explaining to the security guards that he just needed to finish the installation. The finance department would be without internet access for their quarterly reports, but they'd herded him into the main assembly hall with everyone else. Now he sat quietly, occasionally glancing at his phone to check if any urgent tickets had come in through the Helpdesk system, completely oblivious to the cosmic terror unfolding on the screens around him. "The device appears to be some form of reality manipulation weapon," Commander Vexthara continued, her voice growing more strained with each word. "Our preliminary scans suggest it has the capability to alter the fundamental laws of physics within a radius of approximately 12 light-years. Planets, stars, entire solar systems could be unmade with the activation of this device." The crowd erupted in panicked chatter, a cacophony of different languages and communication methods filling the air. The harmonics of Lyra began their traditional death wails, a haunting melody that resonated through the crystalline walls. The crystalline envoys from the shattered worlds started rapidly changing colors, cycling through their entire emotional spectrum in seconds. Even the normally emotionless representatives from the machine consciousness began emitting distressed beeping sounds. Marcus looked up from his phone with mild irritation. The noise was making it difficult to concentrate on a particularly tricky email from someone in accounting who insisted their computer was making weird noises but refused to specify what kind of weird noises or when they occurred. He'd already walked them through basic troubleshooting via email twice, but they kept insisting it was definitely a virus, despite showing no actual symptoms of malware infection. "Furthermore," the commander's voice cut through the noise, "our deep space monitoring stations have detected movement. The device is no longer stationary. It appears to be seeking something. Our trajectory analysts calculate that at its current speed and heading, it will reach the core systems of the Galactic Confederation within 47 standard rotations." The panic in the room reached a crescendo. Several smaller species had formed impromptu prayer circles, while others were frantically making final communications to their homeworlds. The ethereal collective's representative, a being of pure energy contained within a specialized crystalline housing, began flickering so rapidly that the containment field started showing stress warnings. Marcus sighed and looked around the room, finally taking in the scope of the situation. He'd been only half listening to the presentation, assuming it was another one of those interdepartmental meetings about budget allocations or new security protocols. But as he watched the various aliens' reactions, he began to piece together that this was something considerably more serious than usual administrative business. He stood up slowly, laptop bag slung over his shoulder, and began making his way toward the front of the hall. His movement was unhurried, the same pace he used when walking to someone's desk to fix their printer. Several beings turned to stare at him as he passed. Not because he was human, necessarily, but because he was the only person in the entire assembly who didn't appear to be in the grip of existential terror. "Excuse me," Marcus said, raising his hand slightly as he approached the podium area. His voice was polite, but carried the practiced confidence of someone who'd spent years dealing with panicked users who were convinced their computers were about to explode. "Sorry to interrupt, but I couldn't help overhearing. You said your people can't figure out how this thing works?" Commander Vexthar's 4 eyes fixed on him with a mixture of confusion and desperation. Yes, that is correct. Our greatest minds have been studying the device for 72 standard hours without success. Every analysis team we've sent has returned with either complete mental breakdown or total system failure. Are you perhaps a specialist in xenoarchaeology? A theoretical physicist? A military strategist? Marcus shook his head, reaching into his laptop bag and pulling out a small, well-worn notebook. IT support, actually, but I've seen something like this before. He flipped through several pages covered in his neat handwriting, notes about network configurations, common error codes, and what appeared to be a recipe for something called overnight oats. Not exactly like this, obviously, but the symptoms are pretty familiar. The entire hall had gone silent now, thousands of beings straining to hear the conversation. The holographic displays continued their ominous rotation, showing the alien device from every angle, its surface markings seeming to pulse with malevolent energy. Familiar? Dr. Ythkata, the Confederation's leading expert in exotic physics, stepped forward. Her crystalline body chimed softly with each movement, a sound that usually indicated intellectual curiosity, but now carried an edge of desperate hope. "Young human, this device operates on principles that transcend our understanding of reality itself. The mathematical frameworks required to even model its basic functions have driven our quantum computers to the edge of recursive paradox loops." Marcus nodded thoughtfully, the same expression he wore when a user insisted that their password had definitely never been changed, despite the system logs showing 17 password reset attempts in the last month. "Right. Yeah, I can see how that would be frustrating. But here's the thing. Sometimes when something seems impossibly complicated, it's usually because you're overthinking it. Can I see the detailed scans?" Before anyone could object, Marcus walked over to the nearest control console. The operator, a Nexarian with iridescent skin that reflected his emotional state, was currently displaying a deep purple hue that indicated profound confusion. Sir, these controls require Level 9 clearance and specialized training in quantum interface protocols." "Oh, don't worry about it," Marcus said, with the casual confidence of someone who'd spent years working with systems that weren't documented properly. "I just need to look at the raw data for a second." He leaned over the console, squinting at the alien interface for a moment before his fingers began moving across the holographic controls with surprising fluency. The Nexarian operator's skin shifted to a bright orange, the color of amazement, as Marcus navigated through 17 different layers of security protocols and data encryption without apparent effort. "How are you? Those menus aren't even labeled in standard." "Yeah, but the logic flow is pretty intuitive once you get the hang of it," Marcus replied, pulling up a 3-dimensional representation of the alien device. "Plus, most systems are basically the same under the hood, right? Input, processing, output. The trick is figuring out what it's trying to do versus what it's actually doing." Commander Vexthara watched in stunned silence as the human manipulated the display, rotating the device image and pulling up data streams that even their most experienced technicians struggled to access. "This is highly irregular. Our protocols clearly state that unknown devices of this magnitude require extended analysis by certified xenotech specialists." Sure, Marcus said absently, zooming in on a particular section of the device where the alien markings seem to form a pattern. But sometimes you've got to trust the fundamentals. See this here? He pointed to a series of symbols that had been driving the analysis teams to distraction. Your people have been trying to translate this as some kind of ancient language or mathematical formula, right? Dr. Keth'mira, who had been watching from the side while heavily medicated to prevent another breakdown, nodded shakily. The symbols appear to be of unknown origin, possibly predating known civilization by millions of cycles. The complexity suggests a mathematical or mystical significance that our minds simply cannot. Error codes, Marcus interrupted gently. These are error codes. The hall erupted in confused murmurs. Several of the more advanced artificial intelligences began running rapid calculations, trying to process this new perspective. The synthetic mind's representative, who had remained silent since declaring the device impossible, suddenly began emitting a series of soft electronic tones, the equivalent of confused muttering. "I'm sorry," Commander Vexara said slowly. "Did you say error codes?" Marcus nodded, pulling up another section of the display. "Look at the pattern here. You've got what looks like a diagnostic sequence, followed by these recurring symbols that your people interpreted as some kind of mystical significance. But if you approach it like a system throwing errors..." He highlighted several sections of the device's surface where the markings appeared to be flashing in a regular pattern. "Yeah, this thing's definitely throwing errors. Multiple critical system failures, actually. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Dr. Yithkata's crystalline form chimed urgently as she processed this information. "Are you suggesting that this Doomsday weapon, this reality-altering device capable of unmaking solar systems, is malfunctioning?" "Well, I mean, sort of," Marcus said, scratching his head in the universal gesture of someone trying to explain a technical concept to non-technical people. "It's more like, okay, you know when someone calls the help desk because their computer is running slow and they're convinced it's a virus or hardware failure, but it turns out they just have 47 browser tabs open and they're trying to run video editing software on a machine with 4 gigabytes of RAM?" The aliens exchanged confused glances, clearly not following the analogy. Marcus tried again. "What I'm saying is, this device isn't trying to destroy reality. It's trying to run some kind of process, but it doesn't have the resources to complete it properly, so it's stuck in a loop. The reality distortion effects you're seeing? Those aren't attacks. They're basically the universe's equivalent of a blue screen of death." The silence that followed was profound. Every being in the hall was trying to process the implications of what the human had just suggested. The most terrifying weapon ever discovered, the thing that had sent the galaxy's greatest minds into gibbering panic, was apparently just experiencing technical difficulties. Marcus continued working at the console, pulling up more diagnostic information. "See, here's what I think happened. This device was originally designed for something else entirely. Probably some kind of large-scale engineering project. Terraforming, maybe, or stellar manipulation for construction purposes. But at some point, either through damage or just normal wear and tear, it lost connection to its control systems." He highlighted a section of the device that showed what appeared to be communication arrays, many of which were clearly damaged or non-functional. Without proper instructions, it's defaulting to its last known parameters, which were probably something like begin large-scale environmental modification of target area. But since it can't complete the process properly, it just keeps trying over and over again, each attempt causing more reality distortion as it fails to connect to systems that aren't there anymore. The crowd began to murmur again, but this time with a different quality. Instead of panic, there was a growing sense of embarrassment? Could it really be that simple? This is completely contrary to every analysis we've conducted," Dr. Keth'mira said weakly. "Our most advanced theoretical models suggest impossible complexity, recursive temporal paradoxes, mathematics that transcend dimensional barriers." Marcus shrugged, the casual gesture of someone who'd spent years dealing with users who insisted their problems were incredibly complicated, when the solution was usually, "Have you tried turning it off and on again?" "Yeah, but you know how it is. Sometimes the more you think about a problem, the more complicated it gets in your head. Like when someone calls and says their internet is down, and you spend 20 minutes troubleshooting their router settings, only to find out their Ethernet cable was unplugged. Commander Vexthera stared at the human for a long moment, her bioluminescent patches flickering in what her species used to indicate deep thought. Around the hall, thousands of beings waited in suspense, their various forms of breathing, energy cycling, or quantum fluctuation creating a subtle background hum of anticipation. "Mr. Chen, was it?" she said finally, reading from his identification badge. "Are you suggesting that you can simply fix this device? That what has stumped our greatest minds for days can be resolved with basic technical support?" Marcus looked at the display again, scrolling through what appeared to be several hundred different error messages. "Well, I'd have to get closer to really diagnose it properly. Remote troubleshooting only goes so far, you know? But based on what I'm seeing here, yeah, it's probably fixable. Might take a few hours, depending on how corrupted the core systems are, but it's definitely not the impossible cosmic horror everyone seems to think it is." The reaction to this statement was immediate and varied. Several of the more excitable species began what could only be described as hyperventilating, though the exact mechanism varied considerably between beings with lungs, gills, or energy matrices. The crystalline envoys started flashing in rapid, complex patterns that roughly translated to, quote, confused optimism mixed with existential uncertainty. The machine consciousness representative began emitting a steady stream of binary code that, if translated, would have read as, "Recalculating everything, please wait." Dr. Yithkata stepped forward, her crystalline form chiming with barely controlled excitement. "Mr. Chen, if what you're suggesting is correct, this would fundamentally alter our understanding of xenotechnology, advanced engineering principles, and the nature of cosmic threats themselves. The implications for scientific advancement alone." "Right, sure," Marcus said, nodding politely while continuing to work at the console. "But first things first. We should probably stop this thing before it accidentally turns a star into abstract art or whatever it's trying to do out there." He pulled up what appeared to be a tracking display, showing the device's movement through space. The trajectory was indeed heading toward the galaxy's core systems, but as Marcus studied the path, his expression grew more thoughtful. "Huh," he said, zooming in on the route. "That's interesting. See how it's not taking a direct path? It keeps making these little course corrections, like it's looking for something specific." He highlighted several points where the device had changed direction slightly. "This isn't the behavior of a weapon seeking targets. This is more like when you're trying to connect to a network, and your device keeps scanning for available signals." The Nexarian operator, whose skin had settled into a steady blue-green indicating intense focus, leaned closer to the display. "Are you saying the device is searching for something to connect to?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," Marcus replied, pointing to a pattern in the device's movement. "Look at these scan bursts it's emitting every few hours. Those aren't weapons discharges, they're handshake attempts. The device is trying to establish communication with its original control network, but that network probably doesn't exist anymore." Commander Vexthara felt something she hadn't experienced in her 70 years of military service: the sensation of a massive, galaxy-threatening crisis potentially being reduced to a routine technical issue. And without this control network, it simply continues searching. "Pretty much, yeah," Marcus said, opening up what appeared to be a communication protocol analyzer. "And every time it fails to connect, it increases the power of its scanning attempts, which is why the reality distortion effects are getting stronger. It's basically the cosmic equivalent of your router's signal strength, steadily increasing when it can't find your Wi-Fi network." The silence that followed this explanation was different from the previous silences. This wasn't panic or confusion. This was the collective sound of an entire galaxy's worth of assumptions being quietly deconstructed. Dr. Keth'mira, who had spent the last 3 days convinced she was witnessing something beyond the scope of known science, raised a shaky hand. "Mr. Chen, if this device is merely trying to connect to a control network, couldn't we simply provide one?" Marcus looked up from the console with the expression of someone who had just watched a user finally understand why their printer needed to be plugged into work. "Now you're getting it. Though simply might be overstating things a bit. We'd need to reverse engineer the communication protocols, set up a compatible network interface, and probably rebuild some of the corrupted system files. But yeah, theoretically, we could just give it what it's looking for." The implications of this began rippling through the crowd like a wave. Beings who had been preparing final messages to their loved ones were now trying to process the idea that the universe's greatest threat might be resolved by what amounted to technical support. However, Marcus continued, holding up a finger in the universal gesture of someone about to deliver important caveats. There are a few complications. First, I'd need to physically access the device to run proper diagnostics. Second, we're talking about technology that's probably thousands of years more advanced than anything we have here, so there's going to be a learning curve. And third. He paused, scrolling through more of the error logs. Yeah, this thing has been trying to connect for a really long time. Those aren't weapons discharges. They're handshake attempts. The device is trying to establish communication with its original control network. But that network probably doesn't exist anymore. Commander Keth'mira felt something she hadn't experienced in her 70 years of military service. The sensation of a massive, galaxy-threatening crisis potentially being reduced to a routine technical issue. And without this control network, it simply continues searching. Pretty much, yeah, Marcus said, opening up what appeared to be a communication protocol analyzer. And every time it fails to connect, it increases the power of its scanning attempts, which is why the reality distortion effects are getting stronger. It's basically the cosmic equivalent of your router's signal strength steadily increasing when it can't find your Wi-Fi network. The silence that followed this explanation was different from the previous silences. This wasn't panic or confusion. This was the collective sound of an entire galaxy's worth of assumptions being quietly deconstructed. Dr. Keth'mira, who had spent the last 3 days convinced she was witnessing something beyond the scope of known science, raised a shaky hand. Mr. Chen, if this device is merely trying to connect to a control network, couldn't we simply provide one? Marcus looked up from the console with the expression of someone who had just watched a user finally understand why their printer needed to be plugged in to work. Now you're getting it. Though simply might be overstating things a bit. We'd need to reverse engineer the communication protocols, set up a compatible network interface, and probably rebuild some of the corrupted system files. But yeah, theoretically, we could just give it what it's looking for. The implications of this began rippling through the crowd like a wave. Beings who had been preparing final messages to their loved ones were now trying to process the idea that the universe's greatest threat might be resolved by what amounted to technical support. However, Marcus continued, holding up a finger in the universal gesture of someone about to deliver important caveats, there are a few complications. First, I'd need to physically access the device to run proper diagnostics. Second, we're talking about technology that's probably thousands of years more advanced than anything we have here, so there's going to be a learning curve. And third. He paused, scrolling through more of the error logs. Yeah, this thing has been trying to connect for a really long time. Some of these error logs go back months. The longer a system runs in a failed state, the more degraded it becomes. Commander Keth'mira stepped closer to the console, her forearms clasped behind her back in a gesture that indicated serious military consideration. Mr. Chen, what you are proposing, approaching this device. Our previous reconnaissance team suffered complete mental breakdowns within minutes of coming within scanning range. Yeah, about that, Marcus said, pulling up the reconnaissance reports. I think I know what happened there. Look at these brain scans from your affected team members. He highlighted several medical readouts showing the neurological damage suffered by the investigation teams. This pattern of neural disruption, it's not random. It's very specific, and it matches something I've seen before. Dr. Yithkata chimed urgently. You've seen this type of neurological damage before? In what context? Marcus scrolled through his notebook until he found a particular page covered in technical diagrams and troubleshooting notes. Remember about 3 months ago, when half the staff in the research division complained about headaches and disorientation? Turned out the new quantum processing array in Lab 7 was emitting unshielded resonance frequencies that interfered with organic neural patterns. He looked up at the assembled crowd of confused aliens. The device isn't trying to attack people's minds. It's just that when something designed to interface with advanced technology encounters organic brain patterns, there's going to be some compatibility issues. Like trying to plug a quantum computer directly into a biological nervous system without proper adapters. The synthetic mind's representative suddenly spoke up, its electronic voice carrying what sounded like mechanical excitement. Are you suggesting that the neurological damage could be prevented with appropriate interface protocols? Exactly, Marcus said, clearly pleased that someone was following his reasoning. We just need to set up proper signal filtering, and maybe some neural dampening fields. I actually have most of the equipment we'd need down in the IT storage room. We use similar stuff to prevent electromagnetic interference with sensitive equipment. Commander Keth'mira found herself in the surreal position of having to consider sending an IT support technician to resolve what had been classified as a galaxy-ending crisis. Mr. Chen, I must ask, what gives you confidence that you can succeed where our most advanced teams have failed? Marcus considered this question seriously, the same way he considered any technical challenge. Well, here's the thing about troubleshooting. The more complex you assume the problem is, the more likely you are to miss simple solutions. Your teams went in expecting to encounter something impossible, so when they saw things they didn't immediately understand, they assumed it must be beyond comprehension. He gestured toward the holographic display of the device. But I've been fixing broken systems for 15 years. And in my experience, 90% of the time, when something appears to be doing impossible things, it's usually just doing normal things in an unexpected way because something else is broken. The crowd mulled over this philosophy, which seemed almost anticlimactically practical after days of cosmic terror. Several beings began engaging in what appeared to be rapid consultations via various forms of telepathic, electronic, or quantum communication methods. There is another consideration, Dr. Keth'mira said hesitantly. Even if your analysis is correct, approaching this device would be extraordinarily dangerous. If your assessment is wrong, if this truly is a weapon of unimaginable power. Marcus nodded, understanding the concern. Yeah, that's definitely a risk. But here's how I look at it. Right now, we know this thing is heading toward populated systems and causing more damage every day it stays broken. So we've got two choices. We can keep studying it from a distance while it gets worse, or we can actually try to fix it. He pulled up the trajectory analysis again. Besides, if I'm wrong and this thing really is some kind of doomsday weapon, then we're all doomed anyway, right? But if I'm right, and it's just a broken piece of equipment that needs maintenance. He shrugged. Well, then we solve everyone's problem, and maybe learn something interesting about advanced engineering in the process. The logic was undeniable, even if the situation remained surreal. Commander Keth'mira looked around the hall at the thousands of beings hanging on every word of this conversation. Representatives of civilizations that had stood for millennia, technologies that had shaped the course of galactic history, military forces that had defended the universe against genuine threats, all waiting to hear whether an IT support technician thought he could fix their cosmic nightmare with the equivalent of turning it off and on again. Mr. Chen, she said finally, her voice carrying the weight of command decisions that affected billions of lives. If we were to authorize this approach, what would you need? Marcus pulled out his phone and opened what appeared to be a note-taking app. Okay, let me think. I'd need access to a ship with good shielding. Nothing fancy. Just something that can get close without getting fried by the interference. Some basic diagnostic equipment, a portable quantum resonance scanner if you have one, and probably a good neural interface buffer. Oh, and I should probably bring my toolkit. He patted his laptop bag affectionately. That's all? Dr. Keth'mira asked, her crystalline form chiming with disbelief. No specialized xenotechnology teams? No reality manipulation specialists? No backup fleets? I mean, those might be nice to have, Marcus said thoughtfully, but honestly, they'd probably just complicate things. Most troubleshooting goes better when you don't have a committee looking over your shoulder and suggesting increasingly complex solutions to what's probably a simple problem. The ethereal collective's representative, who had been silent throughout the discussion, suddenly began glowing more brightly. When it spoke, its voice resonated through the crystalline containment field with harmonics that suggested deep consideration. This human's approach, it carries an elegance that our complex analyses have lacked. Perhaps simplicity is its own form of wisdom. Marcus looked pleased at this endorsement, though he clearly didn't fully understand the philosophical implications. Thanks. Though honestly, it's not really wisdom so much as experience. When you've spent enough time fixing things, you start to recognize patterns. Commander Keth'mira made a decision that would either be remembered as the most brilliant tactical choice in galactic history, or the most catastrophic error in judgment ever recorded. Very well, Mr. Chen. We'll provide you with a ship and whatever equipment you require. But I'm sending a full support team with you, not to interfere with your work, but to ensure your safety and document the process. Sure, that sounds fine, Marcus said, already making notes in his phone. Though, fair warning, if this goes the way I think it will, it's probably going to be pretty boring. Lot of sitting around running diagnostics and waiting for systems to restart. As the crowd began to disperse, beings heading off to spread the incredible news that the galaxy's greatest crisis might be resolved by routine maintenance, Marcus continued working at the console. He was already deep into planning the technical approach, his mind shifting into the familiar mode of systematic problem-solving that had served him well through countless printer jams, network outages, and mysterious computer errors. The holographic display continued, showing the alien device, its surface markings pulsing with what everyone now realized might not be malevolent energy, but rather the cosmic equivalent of a please wait indicator. Somewhere out in the void, an ancient piece of technology continued its patient search for a network that no longer existed, unaware that help was finally on the way. Commander Vextharo watched the human work, noting how he approached the alien interface with the same calm professionalism he would probably bring to fixing someone's email. She found herself wondering if this was how progress actually happened, not through dramatic breakthroughs or heroic achievements, but through competent people applying practical solutions to problems that everyone else had overthought into impossibility. Mr. Chen, she said as the hall continued to empty around them, may I ask what made you confident enough to speak up when our greatest experts had declared the situation hopeless? Marcus looked up from the console, considering the question. I mean, it probably sounds weird, but I've just seen so many situations where people assume something is impossible because they don't understand how it works. But usually, things work the way they do for pretty logical reasons. Even really advanced technology has to follow basic principles, right? He gestured toward the display. Plus, honestly, this device's behavior reminded me of something specific. A few years ago, we had this old server that was causing network-wide problems. Everyone assumed it was a complex configuration issue or maybe a hardware failure. Turns out it was trying to sync with a backup system that had been decommissioned 2 years earlier. Once we updated its settings to stop looking for the missing system, everything worked perfectly. And you see parallels between that situation and a potentially reality-altering alien device? Marcus nodded matter-of-factly. Well, yeah, scale's different, obviously. But the underlying problem is the same. System trying to connect to something that isn't there, getting progressively more aggressive in its attempts to establish contact. Classic troubleshooting scenario. As the last of the crowd filed out of the hall, leaving only the essential personnel and decision-makers, Marcus began packing up his laptop bag with the methodical efficiency of someone ending a workday. Tomorrow would bring the unprecedented challenge of approaching and potentially repairing technology beyond current understanding, but for now, he had the quiet satisfaction of having identified a problem and proposed a solution. The holographic displays dimmed to standby mode, and the emergency lighting returned to normal, but the fundamental nature of the crisis had changed. What had begun as preparation for the end of civilization had transformed into planning for what might be the most unusual technical support call in galactic history. Outside the command center, word was already spreading through the various communications networks that connected the diverse species of the galaxy. The story being told was strange enough to be almost unbelievable. The universe's greatest threat had been diagnosed by an IT technician who thought it just needed proper network configuration. Marcus, oblivious to the historical significance of what had just occurred, was already mentally planning his approach to the next day's work. He'd need to review the technical specifications, prepare his diagnostic equipment, and maybe grab some coffee for what would likely be a long day of troubleshooting. After all, regardless of the scale or importance of the system involved, the fundamental process remained the same. Identify the problem, understand what the system is trying to do, figure out why it can't do it, and implement the appropriate fix. The device continued its lonely journey through space, its ancient systems patiently waiting for the connection they had been seeking for so long. Soon, for the first time in months, that wait would finally come to an end. The transport vessel Meridian's Edge hummed through hyperspace with the steady vibration of well-maintained engines, though Marcus suspected the rhythmic trembling he felt through the deck plates had more to do with the experimental shielding modifications than normal operation. Captain Zeralin of the Vorthan Republic sat rigid in the pilot's seat, her scaled hands gripping the controls with enough force to leave permanent impressions in the bioresponsive material. Behind her, the bridge buzzed with nervous energy as various crew members monitored systems that had never been tested under these particular circumstances. Marcus occupied a corner workstation that had been hastily reconfigured to accommodate human ergonomics, though the chair still felt like it was designed for someone with a completely different skeletal structure. His laptop was connected to the ship's main computer through an impressive tangle of adapters and converters, creating what the chief engineer had described as, quote, the most unnecessarily complex interface system ever devised. Marcus preferred to think of it as, quote, making things work with what you have. Dr. Veltar, the mission's xenotechnology specialist, paced the small bridge with the manic energy of someone whose worldview had been fundamentally challenged in the past 12 hours. His people, the Carathians, were known throughout the galaxy for their methodical approach to problem-solving and their ability to remain calm under pressure. The fact that he hadn't stopped moving since they departed suggested that Marcus's diagnosis had affected him more than anyone else on the team. The preliminary scans are confusing, Dr. Veltar announced for the third time in the past hour, his voice carrying the strain of someone trying to reconcile contradictory information. The device's energy output fluctuates in patterns that our models cannot predict. The reality distortion fields appear to be completely random, yet your hypothesis suggests underlying order. Marcus glanced up from his screen, where he was reviewing the technical documentation that the Confederation scientists had compiled over the past few days. Most of it read like doctoral dissertations written by people who had never actually worked with the technology they were describing, but there were a few useful details buried in the academic language. Random isn't really the right word, Marcus said, highlighting a section of the sensor data. Look at this pattern here. See how the distortion spikes happen roughly every 47 minutes? That's not random behavior. That's a timeout cycle. The device tries to establish contact, waits for a response, times out, then tries again with slightly higher power settings. Engineer Keth'mira, a member of the Silicon Collective whose crystalline body interfaced directly with the ship's computer systems, chimed with what sounded like electronic confusion. But the power increases are exponential. If this pattern continues, the distortion effects will become catastrophic within days. Right. Which is why we need to get there before it escalates to the point where it starts tearing holes in space-time, Marcus replied, his tone carrying the same urgency he used when explaining to users why they needed to restart their computers before the RAM usage hit 100%. It's basically the cosmic equivalent of a memory leak. The longer it runs without proper maintenance, the more resources it consumes until the whole system becomes unstable. Captain Zarlin's head turned slightly, though she kept her primary attention on the navigation display. Mr. Chen, our estimated arrival time is 6 hours. Can you be certain the device will remain stable until then? Marcus scrolled through more of the diagnostic data, cross-referencing the distortion patterns with what he understood about system behavior under stress. Based on the current escalation rate, yeah, we should be fine, though I'd recommend approaching from the trailing vector rather than directly. If this thing does have some kind of automated defense system, it's probably focused on threats coming from the direction it's moving toward. The suggestion was met with the kind of silence that Marcus had learned to recognize as aliens trying to figure out if the human just said something brilliant or completely insane. It was a familiar sensation from his regular job, usually occurring right after he suggested solutions that worked but weren't in any official manual. Dr. Veltar stopped pacing and turned to face Marcus directly. You speak of this device as though it were merely a malfunctioning computer terminal. But the energy readings suggest technology capable of manipulating fundamental forces at a subatomic level. The complexity involved in creating such effects. Sure, the underlying technology is way more advanced than anything we have, Marcus interrupted gently, recognizing the beginning of another academic lecture. But complexity doesn't mean unpredictability. Advanced systems still follow logical patterns. They have to, or they wouldn't work in the first place. He pulled up a diagnostic interface that he'd been working on during the journey, a simplified representation of the device's behavior patterns translated into terms more familiar to conventional technology. Look, forget about the reality manipulation stuff for a minute. Focus on what the device is actually doing. It sends out a signal, waits for a response, increases power when it doesn't get one, then repeats the cycle. That's not the behavior of a weapon. That's the behavior of a system trying to handshake with a network. Engineer Keth'mira's crystalline form flickered as she processed this information at quantum speeds. Your analogy suggests that all the phenomena we've observed, the reality distortions, the space-time anomalies, the gravitational fluctuations, are merely side effects? Pretty much, yeah, Marcus confirmed. It's like when someone tries to connect a device with too much power to a circuit that can't handle it. You get all sorts of weird electrical behavior, but it's not because the device is trying to cause problems. It's just that the system isn't designed to handle that kind of mismatch. The bridge fell quiet except for the ambient sounds of the ship's systems and the subtle harmonics created by their passage through hyperspace. Marcus had learned to read these silences during his time working with various alien species at the command center. This particular quality of quiet suggested that everyone was simultaneously hopeful and terrified that he might be right. Captain Zaralin finally broke the silence. "Mr. Chen, assuming your diagnosis is correct, what exactly do you plan to do when we reach the device?" "Our scientists have been unable to establish any form of communication with it." Marcus minimized the diagnostic display and opened what appeared to be a simple text editor, though the interface had been modified to work with the ship's alien computer architecture. "Well, first I need to get close enough to run a proper diagnostic. The scans you've been getting from long range are useful, but they're like trying to troubleshoot a network problem by looking at it from across the street. I need to actually interface with the system to see what's happening under the hood." Dr. Veltar resumed his pacing, though at a slightly slower pace. The previous reconnaissance team suffered severe neurological damage within minutes of approaching the device. "What makes you believe you can get closer safely?" "The neural interface buffers we installed should handle most of the compatibility issues," Marcus replied, gesturing toward a collection of equipment that had been secured near his workstation. "Plus, I think the previous teams made the mistake of trying to analyze the device's signals instead of just filtering them out. It's like the difference between trying to understand every error message a broken system throws at you versus just implementing proper error handling." Engineer Keth'mira chimed with what sounded like cautious optimism. "The modifications to our sensor array should allow us to monitor the device's behavior without experiencing direct neural interference. However, the theoretical framework underlying your approach remains unconventional." Marcus had to suppress a smile at the diplomatic way she phrased, quote, "completely crazy, but might actually work." It was the same tone he heard from senior engineers when he suggested solutions that violated established best practices but solved problems that conventional approaches couldn't handle. "Look, I get that this isn't how anyone expected to solve this problem," Marcus said, his voice taking on the patient tone he used when explaining technical concepts to nervous executives. "But sometimes the unconventional approach works precisely because it's not bound by assumptions that might be wrong in the first place." The ship's navigation system chimed softly, indicating their imminent arrival at the target coordinates. Captain Zeralin's hands moved over the controls with practiced precision, bringing them out of hyperspace at what she considered a safe distance from the alien device. The main view screen flickered to life, displaying their destination in all its ominous glory. The device hung in space like a dark jewel, its surface covered in the same symbols that had driven the Confederation's best minds to distraction. But as Marcus studied the real-time image, he noticed details that hadn't been apparent in the long-range scans. The symbols weren't randomly distributed across the surface. They formed distinct patterns, almost like circuit boards or system diagrams, with what appeared to be status indicators scattered throughout. "There," Marcus said, pointing to a section of the device where the symbols pulsed in a regular sequence. "See that pattern? That's definitely a status display. And those sections that are dark? Those are failed components. This thing is basically covered in diagnostic information if you know how to read it." Dr. Veltar leaned over Marcus's shoulder, studying the display with new interest. "You're suggesting that what we interpreted as mystical or mathematical symbols are actually maintenance indicators?" "Status lights, error codes, system diagnostics," Marcus confirmed, already working on the sensor array to get better resolution on the device's surface patterns. Whoever built this thing designed it to be maintainable. They just probably didn't expect it to be running unattended for however long it's been out here. Captain Zaralin initiated a slow approach, keeping the ship's experimental shielding between them and the device's most active sections. "Mr. Chen, our sensors are detecting massive energy buildups within the device's core. Whatever it's trying to do, the power levels are increasing." Marcus pulled up the real-time sensor data, watching the familiar pattern of escalating attempts to establish contact. "Right on schedule. It's trying to handshake again, but since there's still no response, it's going to bump up the power and try again in about 40 minutes. We need to get me over there before the next cycle. The suggestion that he would physically board the alien device was met with immediate protests from every member of the team. Captain Zaralin's scaled features shifted into what Marcus had learned was an expression of extreme concern among her people. Dr. Valdris stopped pacing entirely, his academic composure finally cracking under the weight of what the human was proposing. Mr. Chen, with respect, approaching that device in person would be incredibly dangerous, Captain Zaralin said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen too many good people lost to underestimated threats. The neural damage alone would be prevented by the interface buffers I brought, Marcus interrupted, patting a device that looked like a cross between a helmet and a sophisticated hearing aid. Plus, I can't really diagnose a complex system from the outside. I need to access the internal interfaces to see what's actually happening. Engineer Keth'mira's crystalline form flickered rapidly as she ran calculations at quantum speed. The risk assessment algorithms suggest a 97% probability of catastrophic failure if you attempt direct contact with the device. Marcus considered this statistic with the same expression he wore when users told him their computers would definitely explode if he installed software updates. Okay, but what's the probability of catastrophic failure if we don't do anything and just let this thing keep escalating its power output? The silence that followed was the sound of an entire team realizing that all their options carried significant risks. Marcus used the pause to review his diagnostic equipment one more time, running through mental checklists the same way he prepared for any complex technical challenge. Look, I understand everyone's concerned about the safety aspects, Marcus said finally. But here's the thing about troubleshooting critical systems. Sometimes you have to accept a certain level of risk to prevent a much larger catastrophe. Right now, we know this device is going to keep getting more dangerous every day it stays broken. The question is whether we want to try fixing it now, while it's still manageable, or wait until it becomes completely unstable. Captain Zaralin studied the tactical display showing the device's position and energy output. If we proceed with this approach, what safeguards can we implement? Marcus pulled up a mission plan he'd been working on during the journey. I've designed a gradual approach protocol. First, we position the ship at what should be a safe distance based on the device's current output patterns. Then I take a shuttle to get closer while monitoring for any changes in the device's behavior. If everything looks stable, I attempt to establish a basic interface connection. Dr. Valdris finally spoke up, his voice carrying a mixture of scientific curiosity and professional caution. And if the device responds negatively to your presence, then we abort immediately and try a different approach, Marcus replied with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had dealt with plenty of systems that didn't cooperate on the first attempt. But honestly, based on what I've seen so far, I think it's more likely to respond positively. This thing has been trying to connect to something for months. When it finally gets a proper handshake, it's probably going to be relieved. The anthropomorphization of an ancient alien device struck the team as either profound insight or dangerous overconfidence, though none of them were quite sure which. Marcus, meanwhile, continued his preparations with the methodical approach of someone who treated every technical challenge as a problem to be solved, rather than a crisis to be feared. As the ship continued its careful approach toward the device, Marcus reflected on the strange series of events that had brought him to this moment. Yesterday, his biggest concern had been replacing a faulty network switch in the command center's lower levels. Today, he was preparing to perform maintenance on technology that predated most known civilizations, and had the potential to reshape reality itself. The irony wasn't lost on him that the solution to the galaxy's greatest crisis might come down to the same fundamental principles he applied to every support ticket. Listen to what the system is trying to tell you, understand what it's supposed to do, figure out why it can't do it, and implement the appropriate fix. The scale was unprecedented, but the approach remained familiar. Captain Zaralin brought the ship to a full stop at what her instruments indicated was a safe distance from the device. Mr. Chen, we're in position. Are you certain you want to proceed with this approach? Marcus sealed his equipment bag and picked up the neural interface buffer, checking its settings one more time. As certain as I can be about any troubleshooting job. Sometimes you have to trust your diagnosis and see if the solution works. He headed toward the shuttle bay, followed by a team that was simultaneously convinced he was either about to save the galaxy or destroy it in a spectacularly unprecedented way, The device waited in the void ahead, its ancient systems patiently cycling through another failed attempt to connect to a network that no longer existed, unaware that the help it had been seeking was finally about to arrive. The shuttle drifted through the vacuum toward the ancient device, its hull barely 20 meters from the pulsing alien surface. Marcus floated in the cramped passenger compartment, tethered to the pilot's console by a safety line that felt more psychological than practical at this distance from any meaningful rescue. Through the transparent aluminum viewport, the device's symbols shifted and flowed like living text, each pattern more complex than anything in the galaxy's databases. "Neural buffer is holding steady," reported Dr. Veltar through the comms system, his voice tight with concentration. "But I'm reading massive quantum fluctuations in your immediate vicinity. The space around that device is becoming increasingly unstable." Marcus adjusted the interface helmet and checked his diagnostic tablet one final time. The readings showed exactly what he'd expected: a system running hot, throwing errors, and desperately seeking something to connect to. Copy that. Beginning manual interface approach now. He activated the shuttle's docking clamps and felt the subtle vibration as they made contact with what appeared to be a maintenance port on the device's surface. The moment the connection established, his tablet exploded with data streams that would have overwhelmed any conventional system. Fortunately, Marcus had learned to filter information flows during years of dealing with networks that generated more logs than anyone could reasonably process. "Okay, I'm seeing the handshake protocols now," Marcus reported, his fingers dancing across the tablet's interface as lines of alien code scrolled past. "This is definitely a maintenance system. Whatever this device was originally built for, it was designed to receive regular updates and configuration changes from a central control network." The patterns on the device's surface began shifting more rapidly, responding to the presence of an active connection for the first time, in what the timestamp suggested was approximately 4 standard years. Marcus felt a strange sense of satisfaction as systems that had been dormant began coming online, like watching a long-dead computer finally boot up after successful repairs. "The core processing units are attempting to download updated instructions," Marcus continued, uploading a basic compatibility protocol he'd written during the shuttle flight. "I'm establishing a temporary control interface to prevent it from trying to execute its last known commands while I figure out what those commands actually were." Through the viewport, he could see the reality distortions beginning to stabilize as the device's power output regulated itself for the first time in years. Space itself seemed to exhale as the constant strain of failed connection attempts finally ceased. "Marcus, the gravitational anomalies are normalizing," Captain Zaralin's voice crackled through the comm. "Whatever you're doing, it's working." Marcus smiled as he navigated through the device's file system, which turned out to be surprisingly intuitive once he stopped expecting it to be incomprehensible. Found the problem. This thing was designed to terraform planets. Atmospheric modification, gravitational adjustment, the whole package. But its last job was only half finished when the control network went offline. It's been trying to complete the terraforming sequence for 4 years without knowing where it's supposed to be working. The irony was almost amusing. The galaxy's most feared threat was essentially a construction robot that had been left running without proper supervision. Marcus located the relevant configuration files and began implementing what amounted to a controlled shutdown sequence. "I'm uploading new parameters now," he reported, watching as the device's systems gratefully accepted the updated instructions, basically telling it that the terraforming project has been completed and it can enter standby mode. The change was immediate and dramatic. The pulsing energy discharges that had terrified reconnaissance teams faded to a gentle glow. The symbols on the device's surface settled into orderly patterns that clearly indicated normal operational status. Most importantly, the reality warping effects that had threatened entire star systems simply stopped. "Confirmation on all sensors," Engineer Keth'mira announced, her crystalline voice ringing with what could only be described as relief. "The device has achieved stable configuration. All anomalous readings have returned to baseline parameters." Marcus spent another few minutes running diagnostic checks to ensure the fix would hold, then began the process of safely disconnecting from the device's systems. As he worked, he couldn't help but feel a familiar sense of professional satisfaction. Another day, another successfully resolved technical issue. "Device is now in proper standby mode," Marcus announced as he prepared to undock the shuttle. "It'll stay dormant until someone with the right authorization codes reactivates it." shouldn't be bothering anyone anymore. The journey back to the main ship felt different from the tense outbound flight. Instead of riding toward an unknowable cosmic threat, they were returning from what had turned out to be a routine, if historically significant, maintenance call. Dr. Valdris spent the entire trip staring at his instruments in fascination, while Captain Zarlin maintained the careful composure of someone trying not to think too hard about how close they'd come to universal catastrophe. When they docked with the Meridian's edge, Marcus was greeted by a crew that seemed unsure whether to treat him as a hero or simply a technician who had done his job competently under unusual circumstances. He preferred the latter interpretation and was already thinking about the report he'd need to file when they returned to the command center. "Mr. Chen," Dr. Valdris said as they gathered on the bridge, "what you accomplished today will fundamentally change our approach to xenoarchaeology and crisis management. The implications for our understanding of advanced technology." Marcus nodded politely while packing his equipment. "Sure, though, honestly it wasn't that complicated once you got past all the intimidating surface details. Most systems work pretty much the same way underneath, regardless of how advanced they are." As the Meridian's edge entered hyperspace for the journey home, Marcus settled back into his improvised workstation and pulled out his phone to check for any urgent support tickets that might have come in while he was away. The finance department was still complaining about intermittent network connectivity, and someone in research had apparently managed to crash their quantum computer by trying to run unauthorized simulations. He sighed and began drafting responses, reflecting on how some problems really were universal, regardless of the technological sophistication involved. Behind him, the crew continued discussing the theoretical implications of what had just occurred, but Marcus had already moved on to the next item in his mental queue of things that needed fixing. The ancient device continued its patient orbit in the Omega Nebula, its systems finally at rest after years of fruitless searching. Its diagnostic displays showed all green, its maintenance logs properly updated, and its terraforming protocols safely dormant until properly authorized commands might someday reactivate them for their intended purpose. Galaxy-wide, the emergency broadcasts were already being updated to reflect that the crisis had been resolved through what would officially be described as innovative technical intervention. The full details would be classified for security reasons, though rumors would persist for generations about the IT technician who had fixed the universe's most dangerous malfunction, with nothing more than proper troubleshooting procedures and a willingness to try turning it off and on again. Marcus, meanwhile, had already forgotten about the cosmic implications and was focused on figuring out why the research department's quantum computer kept blue-screening every time someone tried to model theoretical paradoxes. Some problems, he reflected, never really changed regardless of their scale or importance. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.